France had the presidency from January to end of June this year. Sweden will get it in January next year until June 23. So with the Czech Republic, you had or you have a trio, 3 countries working together. Let me start maybe with you, Mr. Journès. France has assumed this rotating presidency while the war in Ukraine broke out. Maybe you can just underline and give us a few details regarding the priorities you had, and looking back, how successful, if we can say so, was the French presidency to start?
Thank you, Raphaël. To give my feeling on that, the first thing when I was confronted myself to the agenda of the French presidency, which it's something that only happened every 13 and a half years, because we're 27. The first thing is you realize how enormous the EU legislative machine is. Because suddenly you have to dig into 200 pieces of legislation which are on the table. And honestly, my first feeling, I have never been posted in Brussels. You realize what an enormous structure it is and how powerful it is in certain fields of our life. The appreciation that I share with you, which I had with our director of the European Union division in Paris, while we were halfway into the presidency, and we had the Ukraine crisis, of course, at that time, was to say that compared with the initial agenda, the way it was moving forward was nominal. And that's very important. About 170 pieces of the legislation which was on the table were achieved and agreed upon, or were at least agreed upon at the level of the trilogues between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. So that's the first lesson. This enormous machine went forward. After what was in, what was the biggest surprise? What are the limits? We did a 3 tripod inside of it of the things which were important to us. One was about relaunching an EU dynamic in a few sectors. One was about affirming the power of the EU, la puissance. And then the third one was about the values, belonging to something in common. Mm-hmm. On that, the thing which I found the most impressive is that on the relance, the relaunch aspect, first we agreed on the relaunch package, which was an enormous bag of money. Second, that we went forward with the Fit for 55 elements which were achievable under the presidency. And the biggest part was the carbon adjustment mechanism at the borders. It's not yet perfect, but nevertheless, it was amazing. And then there was the digital part, which is probably where we went faster than we thought. When we had our preliminary evaluation, we thought that we would advance on the DMA and the DSA, which was a Digital Market Act and Digital Security Act. The DMA is the big cookie in that. It's about how do you control the big players and limit their capacity to do whatever they want. And they both went through, which was faster than we thought. Then we had the part about values, and here there were a few things which were interesting. It's more marginal compared with the big pieces of legislation. But we did find agreement on an agenda on equality. We did find an agenda on racism and anti-Semitism. And there was an echo, which we will come back later to, to what came from citizen consultation regarding the future of Europe. One last thing I wanted to mention, because on that one Switzerland was directly involved through the Schengen mechanism, in the bit which was about puissance. There was a military side, which was the adoption of a strategic compass, Boussole Europe, Boussole stratégique, And there was a bit on the reform of the Schengen governance. And that one was achieved, and that was a consensus with Switzerland, basically having a governance at a council, meaning at a minister level, as a council, which was not the case before, and actually where we went further together regarding the core of Schengen, which is the migration control issues.
Thank you. Mrs. Karlberg, can you maybe give us a few information regarding the current state? I guess you're still in the phase of preparation. Where are you, and on what maybe will focus Sweden in the 6 months of its presidency?
Yes, thank you. I heard for our presidency that we have 350 open issues, so it's not getting less. So the presidency, of course, means that we lead the working group meetings on ambassador level. We lead those meetings, and on a ministerial level, we lead those meetings. So we are supposed to act for the whole of the EU, listen to all countries, and try to find solutions that everyone can agree upon. So that's the main issue. And of course, it can also be an opportunity to bring up issues that are important for Sweden. But we've seen lately that the space to do this has been very limited. You have basically crisis after crisis coming up. We have the energy crisis, we have the Russia's illegal aggression in Ukraine, we had the pandemics. It's been one issue after another. With France and the Czech Republic, we did an 18-month program in the beginning of the France presidency. So Sweden will pick up on to try to focus on some areas. We will pick up some areas from this 18-month program. We just had elections, and we have a new government since 2 weeks. And last time we had a new government, I think it took at least 3 months before it was in place. So we were a bit afraid that we wouldn't have a government when it was time to have the EU presidency. So therefore, a number of topics were agreed already this spring in the parliament with a broad consensus, so that independent if, how long the government would have been in place, we would have our priorities clear. So we have chosen 5 issues that we will work with. And in December, this will be, so we have the titles, but the contents of these 5 issues will be presented in December.
Okay. And maybe, or Mr. Journès, maybe you can give us some more details regarding how it works, this cooperation between all 3 presidencies. So do you, is it just only a common program, and then each of the presidency works on its own, or during the presidencies do you also have coordination? Are you working on it constantly?
Well, it's a very important thing, and Mrs. Karlberg reminded it quite clearly at the beginning. You're not putting forward a domestic agenda when you're presiding the EU. You have to be the fair broker. That's point 1. Second, it's very short, and you're talking about legislations whose process is usually very long. So there is always a coordination between the incoming and the incoming and the previous presidencies. That's the classic trio. What we did this time, which was more original, was to think 2 presidencies ahead. Because some of the subjects we knew required an engagement where the continuity between our action, that of the Czechs, and that of Sweden would be required. There's basically 4 fields. One was on the agenda of protection, which has a big chunk which is on border protection, and there is a big one on the rule of law, and we know that internally within the EU. You have a second one which is on investment. There is a very interesting movement within Europe, actually you have the same one in the United States post-COVID, of reindustrializing. We are trying to bring back industry. That requires heavy investment, and that requires a lot of investment in future technologies. So that's where you see the effort, which is part of the agenda for the 3 presidencies. I will give one example, for instance, for the digital EU, the investment in the semiconductors. That's the huge EU chip program. We're talking about 3.5 billion euros investment, which may go up to 5 billion. So it's a very big piece on the agenda. A third part is more to have a fair EU. That's to answer our citizens regarding, in particular, the health. And the last one is to have a stronger European Union. That implies, to some extent, the defense agenda, but actually what has become the big piece on that is the energy agenda. And that, you're talking about policies, you need to do investment. It was very well debated before us, so I won't repeat it. But if you need to think in an additional manner right now, how do you combine energy transition towards a green energy plus the current shortage? You do have an enormous issue, because the simple tendency right now, if you do only crisis management, is you need to build new gas terminals. If you build gas terminals, you need to make an investment and give the guarantee to the investors that they will have 10 or 15 years to repay. And this is not what we want. We don't want to keep burning fossil gas for 15 years. So that required to be long-lasting, and I believe it's a very good thing for that, that we had achieved this trio program.
Thank you. France and Sweden got and will have the presidency during a time where Europe is dramatically changing. Due to its geography, Sweden had to react very quickly to the war in Ukraine. You have since applied to join the NATO. Maybe allow me to ask you, Mrs. Karlberg, where do you stand regarding the developments of the EU security policies, the Swedish ambitions for it, EU, NATO, how does it work? Where do we see that? Is the EU still finally able to guarantee peace?
It's a huge question.
It is a huge
and I think it was partly debated just before we came up on the stage. I mean, the EU is a peace project in itself, and has created stability and peace in Europe for 70 years now, and has evolved during this time. When it comes to Sweden, I think here I hear a lot. People think we were neutral, and we have not had a neutrality policy for a long time. Our policy has been militarily alliance-free, cooperating with others to build stability. So we have been part of the NATO Partnership for Peace program, just like Switzerland, for a long time. And the NATO question has been debated sort of up and down, but with the extreme change of the security situation in Europe, there was a big majority. It was debated in the parliament, and there was a big majority to go forward and apply for a NATO accession. And actually right now, I think, so we have applied, 28 countries have ratified our accession. Hungary said they will do it before the end of the year, and we're waiting for Turkey. We don't think there is any, I mean, you can be both an EU member and a NATO member. EU is working on defense issues more and more, just like we heard. But EU is much more, it's a multidimensional political organization with overarching legislation, while the NATO is a pure defense and security organization. So, yeah, so it's really two different organizations. One thing that was debated a bit in Sweden during the spring was also the fact that the NATO Article 5 which is the solidarity sort of clause, says that every country should help militarily or defense-wise or security-wise, while the EU has a similar clause but does not mention military help. It can be any kind of assistance. So that was also part of our discussion this spring.
Do you want to react to the question of the security policy, European security policy, and France's view on that? We had earlier the debate on also the role of Germany, maybe to this as well.
No, Ms. Karlberg pointed on that very clearly, and we heard something very wise before, which actually I share personally and as representative of my country. We do work in a system of alliances. There is NATO and Article 5. And Article 5 provides the guarantees that an aggression against a member will be considered as an aggression against the entire alliance. And then Article 5 says that you will coordinate for the response. In the detail of the functioning of the organization, then you have defense planning committees, you have nuclear planning committees, and the enormous structure of the exercise of forces. You need to have, however, one thing in mind. NATO is an organization which is basically managing the treaty and managing Article 5. It plays a very important role in terms of security because it's managing that guarantee. But in terms of budgets, it's a very tiny organization. The budget of NATO is 1.6% of the EU budget. Gives you a scale. It's, if I'm correct, the military budget of NATO is 2.5 billion. You have 300 million of civilian budget. EU, it's 170 billions. The French defense budget, it's 44. The US, it's more than 800 billion. So you put that in comparison. The reality of the defense effort is not within NATO as an organization, it's within the forces of its member states. And the structure is coordinating. The guarantees that exist through Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty is, as you said, very different in nature. It does not say that you will answer militarily. It said you have to look at all means. It's implicitly including. What's very interesting, however, is that you consider yourself through Article 42.7 immediately engaged. And that's the trick. If you read the letter of NATO, Article 5, you are attacked if somebody is attacked, but it doesn't mean you are a co-fighter of the war. You are not co-belligérant. With 42.7, you are co-belligérant. You are at war, but you don't say how you will answer. So that's the very interesting thing. Now, to be realistic, we do believe on a national basis that it is important that the EU as a structure and the Europeans as nation states are relevant in their defense. That means basically what we call the dividends of peace, when we got relaxed back in the early 90s, are over. It's finished. We cannot live with a 0.9 to 1.2% of GDP devoted to defense, as many of us used to do. We are at 2, and it's already way too low. We realize it now that we have an adversary next door, and an extremely aggressive one. What can the EU do in that? And that's the logic of the defense compass, is to think about building our capabilities. We're not going to duplicate, because basically nobody wants it and nobody can afford it. That's where we have to get real. When you're a member of the NATO Joint Command of Forces, it means thousands, I believe for France it was 8,000 officers which we need to send to Evere in Brussels, to Mons, Brunssum, etc. You're not going to do the same thing in an EU headquarters of the same size anytime soon. That's the truth. And for smaller members, you just don't have the workforce. But you need to think of what you can do in common. You need to think of what you can do, for instance, in terms of military industrial capabilities. I quoted to you in my previous intervention the EU Chip Act, 3.5 billion. 3.5 billion is bigger than the NATO budget. If we had an instrument with that sort of capabilities to develop our industrial defense bases, we would have achieved something enormous. That's our kind of thinking.
Maybe to stick to you, you mentioned earlier that President Macron was very supportive of the conference on the future of Europe that ended on the 9th of May this year during the French presidency. Where do we stand now with this? So it was an exercise where the EU institutions, all three of them, tried to engage EU citizens in shaping, discussing the future of the continent, the future of the EU. Conclusions were published on the 9th of May, and now?
It's a very interesting exercise, because if you compare that with what we did when we did the Nice Treaty, back when I was younger, which was a very governmental exercise. We were basically asking ourselves, in terms of government, civil servants, gentlemen's club, if I should say so, what could we do better? And it resulted into a treaty which was put to a vote. It was a disaster. It failed in the Netherlands, it failed in France. And actually, if you think back, we were in 1992 when we had that first failure. Think of the consequences it had on Switzerland and where we stand today. So there has been a genuine interest into doing something different, asking civil society, and I know how skeptical many can be, but it's basically about the thing. You have an intergovernmental structure in Europe. You do have a parliament structure in Europe. You have representative democracy. You do not have direct democracy. And honestly, it's quite difficult to imagine implementing direct democracy when you don't have the culture to do that among 350 million citizens. Not an easy machinery and not accounted for. So we decided to have an exercise where we would ask interested people their opinion. They came out with 49 proposals and about 300 measures, if I'm correct. After that, it went to a technical evaluation. You had many things. It was interesting because part of it was on the core functions of Europe, you know, trade, industry, energy, etc. What was very interesting is that when you were engaging with different people, with younger people also, there was an enormous chunk regarding environment, climate, where we fall behind. There was lots of things about participations. There was lots of things about looking beyond ourselves and our usual agenda as a 27. Some of that can be settled through existing treaty mechanisms. Basically, you have to enhance the efforts on certain policies. So there was an exercise of evaluation of the proposals. That was in June. And now the enormous machine of the committees in Brussels is masticating the whole thing to inject it into some fields. It's very interesting, for instance, because you see one of the results was what has been discussed by our predecessors on this panel, the previous panel, about green hydrogen, or low carbon hydrogen. But basically, that was one of the directions. After, there is part of it which cannot be solved through the current mechanism. The big thing is there are some things on which you need to revise the treaties. And the biggest one is the proposal that the Parliament may have the initiative of new policies, which is not the case currently. And Ursula von der Leyen announced in her speech on the State of the Union that we will undertake a conference of revision of the treaties. It's not going to be an easy task because on some of the aspects, for instance, majority vote on foreign policies, you have certain members who are reluctant or bluntly against. But we decided to engage that. And then there was a question to go beyond our little thing among the 27 members. And that was the idea of the CPE, the conference, the Communauté Politique Européenne, the European Political Community, which was discussed in Prague and now is going to continue, I think, next May, probably 8th of May, in Moldova. Mm. And what is the idea? We're not going to accelerate adhesion. It takes decades. But we are not going to let member states in the waiting room, European states in the waiting room forever without doing nothing, which is the case. I will speak here of a personal experience. I have strong bounds personally in Bulgaria. I've seen Bulgaria in the waiting room of EU adhesion because of a set of good and bad reasons. One was that it didn't make enough progress to go towards good governance, and it needed to restructure certain fields. And there was also very bad reasons. One being that there was no problem for existing members to let Bulgaria's agriculture decay so that it wouldn't be competitive. So it was better that it be dead before they joined. And then you had Eastern European members who were getting European fundings and West European members still getting fundings who knew that if Romania and Bulgaria were joining too fast, they will suck out all the money. And so we let them wait. The cost was terrible. We basically let them in a waiting room for 7 years while they were actually ready. And then they had the lack of modernizing, lack of making the country attractive for its own people. It resulted into a bad governmental experience, the Boyko Borisov moment, and a huge brain drain towards Northwestern Europe. So we cannot do that. That's the subject of the European political community. It's also open to Turkey, because we need to have engagement with Turkey when we're talking, for instance, of the Balkans. It doesn't make sense to talk of the Balkans without Turkey. We need Switzerland, because Switzerland, even though it doesn't want to be an EU member, it is a player on the continent, and this is a right place to discuss about energy, security, sorry, and autonomy. Switzerland is very relevant with the Balkan states. You have a presence there, a good knowledge, and actually you are a good example in terms of good governance. And that's it. That's where we are trying to move ahead for now.
Mrs. Karlberg, your views on the needs eventually for the EU to change and adapt itself. We mentioned the possible convention to revise the treaties, the need also to do more in regard of climate, environment. How do you see these aspects?
Generally, I think we've seen the EU change and update various times. When we had the EU presidency in 2009, that was when the Lisbon Treaty was accepted. So it made the EU more efficient. You started having the council meetings in Brussels, which saved a lot of money. Like a lot of things like this are happening, I would say, continuously. It's a big machinery, it takes time. But I think the EU sees the need to adapt and keeps adapting. Another recent example, I think, is the rule of law conditionality. So, I mean, when the EU sees problems coming up, you know, we have to deal with this. How do we deal with this? And you progress and you develop. I mean, it's not a static organization. It's evolving. Mm-hmm. And we were just talking about security policies. So I would say it might take a long time, but it is an organization that is constantly developing itself. I mean, the EEAS was established in 2011. Mm-hmm. It's evolving.
Mm-hmm. A very last question for you, especially Mrs. Karlberg, Sweden. Do you saw a shift in the perception of the EU within the Swedish population now that we have a war in Ukraine, an energy crisis, very concretely in a few words?
Yes, we have seen a shift. How should I say, the people who have been pro-Europe and against, pro-EU and against, has been quite stable figure for even since we entered in 1995. So it's been about 60% pro and around 15% against. With the aggression, Russia's illegal aggression in Ukraine, the pro went up to 65%. So there was a shift upwards in the support for the EU. And I think it also went up in... There is a university that has done a study every year since we entered in the European Union. So you can really see a quite stable line. And it already went up in 2021 during the pandemics. And I think it was, one reason was the EU's handling of the vaccination and buying big amounts and distributing to all the countries. And now with Ukraine, you see an even bigger shift upward. But when we entered in 1995, it was 52, we had a referendum before. It was a 52% pro, so we entered. And in 10 years, we had increased our exports to the EU with like 150%. We benefited largely from EU's trade, free trade agreements with other countries. So I would say there hasn't really been, since we entered, there's never really been a discussion on leaving or it's always been a stable support, which now has increased.
We are running a little bit late, so I suggest to wrap up and ask you a very last question. In your view, and maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Ambassador, what makes the EU a project fit for the future, to stay positive and hopeful?
I could answer by the negative. First, what would be the alternative? To think quietly, just for a second. Let's remove it. No more agricultural policy, which means absolutely none of us is capable of exporting any agricultural products beyond the continent. No digital policy, so each of us alone in front of Amazon, and we don't wait much. No energy policy or energy joint efforts. No Schengen, back to the borders ID. No free movement, which means behind that, no social security equivalence, no retirement automatism. And then it becomes much more difficult if you hire people and you tell them, well, you stopped existing in your domestic social security system. People don't want to leave their country anymore. It becomes very dangerous unless you live forever. We just tend to forget, you know, everything nice that Europe does, we just forget about it because it seems so obvious. We are crossing the borders, we're exporting our products, our companies don't need to file red tape when they ship something to Sweden or Malta or Greece. We just forgot it is not automatic. If you want to know what it looks like when it doesn't exist, you look at Central America, you look at Africa, you do not have free trade movement between African countries. So there is basically extremely limited trade within those countries. And we are a power. We do have a bartering hand, bargaining hand also when we are discussing with the United States, with Canada, with South America, as you said. When you are a newcomer in the EU, suddenly you have extremely advantageous free trade agreements, which the 27 have negotiated with their partners. And it's, if you see Switzerland has been trying to have a free trade agreement with the US. Alone, it's extremely hard. We did it with Canada. So you basically benefit from that strength. Alone, you just don't have nothing of it. And you lose everything that we've built.
Mrs. Karlberg?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we also tend to forget a bit everything that has been achieved. I mean, I was young before we were part of the EU. I wanted to go to Spain to work. I couldn't. I wouldn't get a work visa. I was one of the first Erasmus students, an amazing project. I mean, there's so many valuable things that we tend to forget. Just the roaming. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so many. But I think democracies that function with rule of law, human rights, equality, tend to be the most stable structures of nations. And I think this is part of the EU's core values. And just by being part of these core values and being something that EU strives for and works for will help it to be relevant. I also think taking the lead on fighting climate change is just one other reason for the EU to remain relevant. And you have many examples like that. The gender equality plan, you have many of these that will keep taking EU forward into the future.
Thank you very much. We'll continue the discussion this afternoon. We have 2 panels planned on climate, environment, social questions, and digital innovation questions. So thank you very much for already having allowed us to start with these reflections and participating in this event. Merci beaucoup.